What does a seaside smell like when a hero has just left it behind? You step through the cool hush of a moonlit beach, your feet sinking slightly in the damp sand, and you swear you can almost hear the echo of a high-pitched laugh carried by the wind, half joy, half mischief. It's the kind of night where the air itself feels bewitched, humming softly between your ears as if time has paused to listen. The waves drag thin ribbons of foam across the shore like a hand erasing chalk, and the stars seem brighter here, as though honoring someone too small to fill a grave, yet too large to ever be forgotten. You know this place from whispers. Shell Cottage, where the war against darkness once brushed against peace for a few fleeting hours. And tonight, you've come not as a wizard, nor as a historian, but as a wanderer, looking for the last traces of Dobby the Free Elf. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge closer to the tide line, hearing the sand crunch like old parchment, and realize this isn't just any beach. It's a place where grief met gratitude. The house in the distance still glows faintly, maybe from lanterns or from the kind of light memories refuse to extinguish. You crouch, brush your hand across the sand, and feel how fine it is, like the dust of a story retold too many times. Dobby's last night began right here, beneath skies swollen with storm, when he appeared holding the lives of others in his tiny hands. Historically, the house elf's magic was once classified by the Department of Mysteries as servile thaumaturgy, a branch of spellcraft believed to be inherently limited by obedience. Yet even scholars admit the theory breaks down when you say his name. Dobby defied the oldest magical law, that power must be born of domination. He chose to serve kindness instead, which, depending on which historian you ask, makes him either the most dangerous or the most enlightened creature magic ever produced. The sea air nips your skin, reminding you that stories like his don't come wrapped in fairy lights. They come soaked in salt and truth. You notice a sock half buried in the sand, its colors long faded, perhaps dropped by a passing child. You can't help but smile, thinking how that single piece of clothing changed everything. There's a soft joke in history about Dobby's kind, that for centuries, wizards kept house elves because no one could conjure a creature so efficient with laundry. But the deeper joke, perhaps the cosmic one, is that a scrap of laundry became the symbol of emancipation. You imagine him clutching that sock, trembling not from fear, but from disbelief, realizing that freedom could fit in his palm. Somewhere in this same wind he once whispered, "Dobby is free," and though it's been years, you swear the night hasn't stopped echoing the line. If you close your eyes, the sea becomes a lullaby, an old Welsh rhythm maybe, because the cliffs here still hum with stories older than Hogwarts itself. The Ministry archives mention that coastal elves used to gather seashells to store sound, believing that the ocean could keep their ancestors' voices safe. You tilt one to your ear, half mocking yourself, and hear nothing at first, then a faint giggle, or maybe just your pulse. Either way, it's proof that legends like Dobby's live best in the small, quiet corners of reality. And when you open your eyes again, you realize the sand beneath you feels warmer now, as if someone had just stood there moments before, barefoot and free. You probably wouldn't survive his life, the secrecy, the servitude, the impossible courage it took to stand up to both masters and monsters. But tonight, under this silver-tinted sky, you can at least understand it. Freedom isn't loud. It's the hush that follows when fear finally stops talking. You wake before dawn, or maybe you never really slept, because how can you, after hearing the sea murmur someone's name all night? The horizon is a bruise of gray and lilac, and somewhere out there a gull cries like a cracked whistle. You walk along the line where the waves meet the sand, tracing the memory of a sock that changed everything, Dobby's sock, of course, the one that looked ordinary until it didn't. You imagine it now. Rough wool, slightly oversized, smelling faintly of dust and triumph. Wizards might write tomes about bloodlines, curses, and wand lore, but a single sock brought down centuries of quiet slavery. It's the kind of absurd twist history pretends not to notice, because it reminds everyone that power sometimes slips through their fingers in the silliest ways. The archives say that the Malfoy family employed at least 6 generations of house elves, none of whom ever spoke against their masters, until Dobby. He wasn't supposed to want more than service, yet he did. Some scholars call it an evolutionary anomaly in magical psychology. Others whisper it was empathy, a mutation rarer than magic itself. You can't help smiling, imagining Lucius Malfoy's face as that dirty piece of fabric hit his palm and the spell of obedience shattered with it. The wizarding world never quite forgave the symbolism. A free elf upset the social order. It was like watching a portrait step out of its frame and demand voting rights. Dobby's sock is still preserved somewhere, or so rumor claims. Perhaps in the Department of Magical Artifacts, filed under Cultural Disruptors, alongside the first Remembrall and one of the Weasley twins' surviving skiving snack boxes. If you think that sounds absurd, it's because it is. History often hides revolutions inside jokes. You might laugh now, but back then, some of the pureblood families treated that sock like a political scandal. There are letters, actual parchment documents, detailing the need to re-establish proper domestic hierarchy. In other words, panic that kindness had gone viral. A ministry clerk even suggested banning articles of clothing as gifts to magical beings, which makes you wonder if irony itself is a wizard. As you stroll, the sand gives way to tufts of grass, sharp and thin as quills. You find yourself thinking about what it meant for Dobby to wear clothes after that. He never dressed for vanity, only for the joy of it. Each mismatched pattern, every absurd color, was a declaration of identity. There's a painting in the Hogwarts basement. You'd need to sneak past a certain portrait of the fat lady to find it, depicting him holding a sock like a trophy, eyes wide as if he still can't believe freedom doesn't hurt. The painter was a Hufflepuff student, circa 2001, who later became a scholar of magical ethics. Her thesis argued that Dobby's liberation marked the third wave of wizarding conscience, a phrase that sounds grand, but really just means people started feeling guilty about being awful. Still, change is slow. Even after the war, most elves chose servitude willingly. They said freedom was confusing. That choice was heavier than chains. It's the kind of philosophical paradox that still sparks debates in wizarding academia. Was Dobby truly free if he devoted that freedom entirely to others? The sea wind picks up, carrying a chill that smells faintly of kelp and old parchment. You pull your cloak tighter. Not that you have one, but in your mind you do, because every proper bedtime story deserves good wardrobe continuity. A gull swoops low, stealing a crust of bread you didn't realize you'd dropped. You mutter a curse under your breath, then laugh, thinking Dobby would have scolded you for unkind words, even toward a bird. He believed in decency as if it were magic, which might be why his magic worked better than anyone expected. Some historians, the more poetic ones, suggest that house elf enchantments are strengthened by sincerity. That's a debate still unresolved in the Journal of Applied Thaumaturgy, where one cranky professor once wrote, "If love truly amplifies power, then Hogwarts would explode every Valentine's Day." You suspect Dobby would have laughed at that, then offered to help clean up the mess afterward. When you glance back at the footprints behind you, they already fade beneath the tide. Fragile, temporary, like everything he fought for. Yet in that fleetingness lies the point. A sock, a gesture, a laugh. They vanish quickly, but what they start doesn't. The sock wasn't just an object of freedom, it was a lesson disguised as laundry. Freedom isn't granted by law or lineage, it's claimed in moments of absurd bravery. Dobby understood that before anyone else. And as the first rays of light catch the waves, you realize the beach looks almost gold now, shimmering softly, as if the world itself is applauding the smallest hero it ever knew. The morning stretches itself into the kind of pale gold that only happens after stormy nights. The horizon washed clean as if the sky has just apologized. You wander inland, following the narrow trail that Dobby once used when he was newly free, a path worn not by footsteps, but by determination. They say that for months after gaining his freedom, he had nowhere to go. The wizards didn't know what to do with a free elf, and the elves didn't know what to do with one who refused to bow. You can almost picture it, Dobby trudging along the hedgerows of the English countryside, his mismatched socks wet from dew, singing to himself in a voice that cracked like an old kettle. You probably wouldn't have lasted a day in his shoes, or rather his lack thereof, because freedom, as it turns out, isn't warm or comfortable. It's cold, confusing, and full of second looks from people who can't decide whether to applaud you or pity you. And yet, Dobby never wavered. He didn't want pity, he wanted purpose. There's something almost revolutionary in that. A creature created for servitude redefining service on his own terms. Historians call it post-domestic identity formation. You can call it courage. For a while, Dobby worked at Hogwarts. Ironic, really. The place where he'd once tried to protect a boy by nearly killing him with a bludger. He requested wages, a day off per month, and the right to wear what he pleased. When Professor Dumbledore agreed, it scandalized the entire staff. Some professors whispered that the headmaster had gone sentimental. Others found it refreshingly progressive, though none of them dared let their own elves hear that phrase. But Dobby didn't care about the politics of approval. He scrubbed the castle floors, humming sea shanties, traded socks with students, and left knitted caps in the laundry as gifts. There's even a note in the Hogwarts employment records, yes, it exists, describing him as unusually cheerful, occasionally insubordinate, and entirely indispensable. The line was written by Minerva McGonagall, who, according to one rumor, once found Dobby lecturing a ghost about workers' rights. If that sounds implausible, well, so does flying on a broomstick. And here we are. Freedom also came with loneliness. Dobby lived between worlds, neither elf nor wizard, always welcomed, yet never fully belonging. In wizarding sociology, this state has a name: liminal sentience. A creature aware enough to see the walls of its world, but too kind to tear them down completely. He'd visit Diagon Alley at night, helping lost children find their parents, or leaving coins in the hats of buskers playing off-key flutes. A Muggle-born witch once wrote in her diary that she saw a small man in patchwork clothes bowing to the moon, as if thanking it for its company. That image lingers with you now. The idea of Dobby living quietly, believing that gratitude could be its own kind of rebellion, and maybe it was. By afternoon, the wind carries the smell of grass and old fireplaces. You pass what used to be a shepherd's cottage, its roof sagging, ivy climbing the chimney like a green snake. The place reminds you of how Dobby found temporary homes wherever kindness happened to pass by. He slept in cupboards, attics, and once reportedly inside a wardrobe at Flourish and Blots. Cozy, he'd said, if you don't mind the talking books. You laugh out loud at that, startling a crow that scolds you from a fence post. Humor was part of Dobby's armor. When everything else about his kind was defined by fear, he met the world with delight. And that's something even the most rigid historians admit. Joy, for Dobby, was defiance. Still, not everyone shared his optimism. Some house elves mocked him, calling freedom a sickness. In the dim kitchens beneath Hogwarts, debates flared like little domestic rebellions. Could elves survive without orders? Could they exist without the certainty of duty? The answers, depending on who you ask, range from tragic to transcendent. Even today, magical ethicists argue about whether the free elf phenomenon would have spread if Dobby hadn't died a martyr. Some claim it was inevitable, a slow cultural evolution. Others insist it needed a symbol, and Dobby became one the moment he stopped serving fear. You're inclined to agree with the latter. History rarely moves without someone brave enough to break a rule written in someone else's handwriting. The day grows softer as the sun leans west. You pause near a patch of wildflowers, purple heather and forget-me-nots trembling in the breeze. And think how strange it is that the smallest lives often leave the largest echoes. Somewhere between servitude and freedom, Dobby found a truth that scholars, philosophers, and wizards are still trying to articulate: that dignity doesn't require permission. He didn't need titles or applause, just a chance to choose his own kindness. And maybe that's what makes him unforgettable. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the rustle of the grass, and swear the wind sounds like laughter again, faint, distant, but proud. The trail narrows as you follow the whisper of the tide inland, winding through dunes tufted with wind-stressed grass. The sun has already begun to sink, leaving long shadows that stretch like memories across the sand. Somewhere between the sound of waves and the sigh of wind, you find it. A hollow, barely visible unless you're looking for something that isn't supposed to be found. Dobby's secret underground home. It's small, almost comically so, as if designed by someone who never quite trusted the world to leave him alone. You crouch to peer inside and see a doorway of driftwood, patched together with twine and bits of rope. A scallop shell hangs above it like a charm, etched with a shaky hand into the shape of a heart. You hesitate before stepping in, half expecting to disturb the air of something sacred. Inside, the space is warm and round, carved directly into the sand and lined with smooth stones that shimmer faintly, as though touched by wand light long ago. The smell is a blend of sea salt, candle wax, and something softer, like wool that's been dried too close to a fire. Here, in this hidden burrow, you can imagine how Dobby must have lived. Part craftsman, part caretaker, always busy, always preparing for others. Against one wall sits a rough wooden table scattered with tiny tools, needles, thimbles, scraps of colorful cloth. There's even a miniature clothesline strung across the ceiling with socks hanging in mismatched pairs, swaying gently in the draft like prayer flags. You can't help smiling at the sight of them, realizing that for Dobby, clothes weren't fashion. They were freedom stitched into fabric. Scholars often dismiss this kind of domestic magic, preferring to focus on grand spells and dueling techniques. Yet it's rumored that one of these very socks once glowed faintly blue when danger was near, a sort of improvised charm. No one's ever proven it, but one eccentric magical anthropologist suggested that Dobby's enchantments were woven through intention rather than incantation. It's the kind of phrase that gets laughed out of conferences but whispered about in pubs after closing. You find small things everywhere. A polished seashell with initials carved inside, perhaps belonging to one of the witches he rescued. A fragment of parchment that reads only, "For Harry, should he ever return." It's impossible not to feel the ghost of a smile in those words. Historians sometimes debate whether Dobby's final days were planned, whether he knew somehow that his last act of heroism was drawing near. The ministry's official record claims he was merely in the right place at the right time. But the older wizards who fought in the war tell a different story. They say he had been preparing for weeks, traveling quietly, mapping safe houses, and crafting protection charms for refugees. Beneath his innocent manner hid a strategist's heart. You run your fingers along the stone walls, and for a moment, you can almost hear him bustling about, muttering proudly about socks and safety. The burrow's only window is a hole that opens toward the sea, framed by the curling roots of a dune grass. Through it, the last light of day spills in, painting everything gold. Dust motes drift lazily in the air, moving like slow fireworks. It's here, in this tranquil silence, that you realize how much of Dobby's courage came from gentleness. He didn't fight because he hated, he fought because he loved. There's a difference, and it's one even wizards often forget. You crouch, imagining him here on stormy nights, sewing patches onto clothes, whispering to the ocean as though it were a friend. A detail buried in an old Daily Prophet article mentions that Dobby often talked to the sea, believing the waves could carry gratitude to those who'd been kind to him. Some call that superstition, others call it theology in miniature. Either way, it sounds more human than most humans you know. You sit on the packed earth floor and let the quiet fill you. There's something humbling about standing in the last home of someone who never owned anything yet gave everything. Outside, the wind shifts, carrying the faint sound of gulls and distant bells from the village. The air tastes faintly of salt and goodbye. You imagine Dobby here, the night before his final rescue, tying his shoes, straightening his mismatched socks, determined as always to bring light where others found only fear. And suddenly you understand what historians mean when they write that he lived in service, but died in choice. His little burrow isn't a ruin. It's a reminder that even the smallest sanctuaries can outlast empires. The sand, the sea, the silence, they've all agreed to remember him. And now, you have too. Evening falls slow and amber over the coast, and you make your way back toward the path that winds inland. The air feels different now, heavier somehow, the way it gets before a storm or a revelation. From the distance, you hear faint chatter, the rise and fall of voices that belong to memory more than presence. You picture the burrow, the Weasleys' old house standing like a crooked miracle, its mismatched chimneys puffing out smoke that smells of supper and stubbornness. It was from there that news traveled like sparks, rumors of disappearances, whispers about Voldemort's army, and eventually tales of a strange free elf who appeared wherever help was most needed. Dobby's back, they'd say in awe, half as joke, half as prayer. You imagine the kitchen crowded with people, Molly stirring stew, Arthur tinkering with a radio, Fred and George pretending not to be scared, and somewhere outside, Dobby eavesdropping from a window ledge, beaming just to be included. Freedom had made him a legend, though he never asked for that. To wizards, he was a curiosity. To elves, a heretic. To the few who truly knew him, a friend. He moved between these worlds like a rumor with legs. There's even a report, filed quietly within the Order of the Phoenix Archives, describing Dobby as the most reliable courier of classified information. Apparently, he could pop in and out of guarded spaces without triggering any wards, a feat most Aurors couldn't replicate. House elf magic doesn't obey the same geometry, Hermione once explained in a later interview. It's not about force, it's about intention. You roll that thought around in your mind as the wind picks up, intention over force. Maybe that's why Dobby's power worked. It wasn't a rebellion of strength, but of sincerity. The war was building by then, slow and dreadful like thunder that never quite arrives. The Weasleys, the Order, and even Harry himself had become fugitives in all but name. Hogwarts was a fortress, the Ministry a weapon. The world was shrinking, and yet Dobby's reach somehow grew. He helped smuggle information, move people, and even deliver food to hidden families. A fringe theory, found in a tattered academic journal you once stumbled across online, argues that without Dobby's covert actions, the final phase of resistance would have collapsed weeks earlier. No one can prove it, but history has a way of whispering truths through coincidences. And perhaps the truest thing about him is that his courage never needed to be witnessed to exist. You stop near a cluster of rocks overlooking the sea and light a small lantern you brought along, more symbolic than practical. The glow flickers over your hands, making you feel like part of the story now. Somewhere beyond this point, Dobby had listened to these same waves, maybe even humming to them while waiting for news. The voices from the burrow would have reached him through others, stories of loss, of capture, of the boy who lived still fighting to live. Each rumor would have been another thread tying him back to those he loved. Maybe that's why he stayed near the coast. It was close enough to hear hope knocking. Scholars love to debate whether elves possess souls. It's a tiresome argument that's lasted centuries, usually in rooms lit by expensive chandeliers and filled with people who've never known servitude. But as you stand here, wind on your face and salt on your tongue, the question feels meaningless. Whatever animates the air tonight feels like more than magic. It feels like memory refusing to fade. If that isn't a soul, then perhaps the definition is too small. You think about the sound of the burrow's clock, the one that didn't tell time but tracked the whereabouts of its family members. In some forgotten corner of the Weasley home, there should have been a tiny hand labeled Dobby Safe. If it ever existed, it must have stopped moving the night he fell. The sea below turns the color of pewter. Somewhere between the fading light and the first stars, you realize how thin the line is between bravery and tenderness. Dobby never separated the two. He believed that to care was to fight. His laughter wasn't an escape from fear, it was defiance against it. In the coming nights, the war would reach its fever pitch, and Dobby, the smallest warrior of all, would take one last step into legend. For now, though, you let the silence settle, the kind that makes you aware of your heartbeat. Behind you, the burrow's imagined voices fade like a lullaby, warm, fragile, human. You whisper a quiet goodnight to them, and the wind carries it somewhere only the sea can hear. The air thickens as night falls again, that peculiar kind of darkness that makes the sea feel infinite and the world very small. You walk until the sound of the waves fades behind you and the forest begins, bare branches scratching at the sky like quills, desperate to rewrite fate. Somewhere beyond these trees lies Malfoy Manor, and even now, so many years later, the place seems to radiate coldness, like an afterthought of cruelty. You can almost see it in your mind, the white marble hallways gleaming like bones, portraits whispering warnings, chandeliers dripping with light that never felt warm, and within those walls, prisoners waiting in fear, including the ones Dobby came to save. That night, his last mission, has been told in fragments, eyewitness accounts, half-legends, smudged memories from those who were too terrified to speak clearly. But what's certain is this: when the call came, Dobby didn't hesitate. He didn't need orders, strategy, or backup. He simply went. Imagine it now. An elf apparating into the lion's den, unarmed, except with loyalty. The manor's air was thick with curses and old money, the kind of place where even the wallpaper was probably prejudiced. Down in the cellars, Harry, Ron, Hermione, and others waited, bruised, bloodied, believing rescue was a fantasy. Then came that sound, soft as a sigh. Crack. Dobby had arrived. He must have looked impossibly small in that grand, hateful room, his mismatched socks and wide eyes clashing with the severity of everything around him. But that's the thing about courage. It's rarely proportional to size. Historians later described his arrival as an improbable act of domestic magic turned militant. One scholar, particularly dramatic, called it the rebellion of the broom closet. You laugh at that, even though it's morbidly fitting. The elf who once ironed pillowcases was now dismantling tyranny one disobedient act at a time. It's easy to romanticize that moment, but picture the fear too. The sting of curses zipping through the air, the flash of green and gold light against the marble floor. Dobby's magic wasn't meant for war. It was meant for home, for tidying, for helping. Yet that night, every spell he cast carried centuries of suppressed will. He disarmed Lucius Malfoy's son with a flick of his fingers, shattered chandeliers to confuse the Death Eaters, and popped prisoners out of harm's way faster than anyone could comprehend. A ministry reconstruction report later tried to chart his apparition pattern that night, only to conclude, rather helplessly, House Elf magic remains in flagrant violation of spatial law, which, translated from bureaucratic nonsense, means he broke reality just to keep others safe. You pause as you walk, hearing the echo of wind move through branches like faint applause. In your mind's eye, the scene sharpens, the panic, the chaos, and through it all, Dobby standing upright, trembling, but resolute. There's something heartbreakingly comic about it, too. One witness said he muttered apologies after stunning Bellatrix Lestrange as if worried about being rude. That was Dobby in a nutshell, polite even to evil. A few historians have speculated that his kind of morality, untainted by hierarchy, made him resistant to dark magic altogether. It's a theory you can almost believe. Evil feeds on ego, and Dobby had none. Then comes the turning point, the sound of Bellatrix's scream, the silver flash of a knife, and a gasp too small for history to record. Dobby's hand clutching the arm of the boy he'd sworn to protect, whispering that single promise, Dobby never meant to harm. He didn't. He only ever meant to save. The knife found him anyway. There's an entire field of magical ethics dedicated to the question of free-willed sacrifice, but standing here in the cold hush of memory, it feels simpler than that. He didn't die for duty. He died because love told him to move faster than fear. The night deepens, and the forest exhales around you. You tilt your head back, catching glimpses of stars between the branches, and think about how absurdly fragile the world can be, how the difference between cruelty and compassion can come down to a heartbeat. Somewhere out there, the ruins of that manor still stand, the marble polished by ghosts. And maybe, just maybe, if you listen close enough, you'll hear a soft voice echoing through those empty halls. Dobby is happy to be with his friends. It's not a line of defeat. It's the sound of freedom declaring itself one last time. The sea waits for you again. You step out from the fringe of the forest and feel the salt wind slap your cheeks like a cold hand bringing you back to the present. The waves are heavier tonight, the sky low and woolen, the kind of night where the horizon erases itself. You find the stretch of beach where it happened, the moment between life and legend, and for a while you just stand there, letting the surf fill in the silence that words could never manage. This is where Dobby appeared with Harry in his arms, the knife still glinting, the tide pulling close as if the sea itself wanted to hold him. There's no monument here, no marble statue or gilded plaque, just sand and the sound of water breathing. You kneel, brushing your hand over the place where the story turned from action to stillness, and for the first time, you understand why wizards call the ocean the great undoing. It smooths everything, the sharp edges of grief, the footprints of war, the weight of endings. Historians write about that moment clinically. Subject expired shortly after apparition due to external puncture wound. But the real version is quieter, softer, unbearably human. Harry cradled him, Ron knelt wordless beside him, and Luna whispered a blessing that made the stars seem to lean closer. Dobby looked up at them all with wide, unblinking eyes and smiled. He wasn't afraid. He had always lived with the clarity of someone who had already been through the worst and decided to be kind anyway. The knife, silver, elegant, cruel, caught him unawares, but not unprepared. He'd already made his choice the moment he said, "Harry Potter must not go back to that place." You feel a chill at the thought. He wasn't saving one boy, he was saving the idea that goodness could still be louder than fear. You sit on a driftwood log and watch the waves curl and break. Somewhere down the coast, Shell Cottage still glows, its windows flickering like small hearts in the dark. The people inside would have been frantic that night, trying to save him. Hermione with trembling hands, Luna whispering comfort, Bill calling for potions no one had. It's strange to think of magic, that boundless force of miracles, being powerless in that moment, but maybe that's what makes it sacred. The reminder that not even wizards can outspell mortality. There's a line from an old Celtic ballad, "The sea takes what it loves and gives it back as story." Maybe that's what this place has done, turned sorrow into narrative, tragedy into teaching. A salty drizzle begins to fall, fine as ash. You tilt your face up, letting it sting your eyes, imagining it's the sea's way of crying. Somewhere, a gull screams like a broken violin. The world feels unreasonably alive for a moment of death. You think about the smallness of the weapon, a kitchen knife, really, and how it managed to fell a being capable of breaking every magical rule. There's a grim poetry in that. Sometimes history is written not in prophecies but in accidents. Yet Dobby's end wasn't senseless. It was symmetrical. He'd been enslaved by the Malfoys and died freeing others from them. That's narrative perfection, the kind that storytellers envy and philosophers fear. You pick up a shell near your foot, its spiral etched with time, and hold it to your ear. The wind hums through it, a faint whisper that might just be imagination, or something more. Scholars who study posthumous resonance, a very fancy term for magical echoes, say that some places hum with energy where powerful magic or love has been released. They use instruments to measure it, all blinking lights and rune sensors. But here, you don't need devices. The air itself vibrates gently, as if tuned to one note of gratitude. You realize, with a soft pang, that this beach isn't haunted. It's blessed. You glance once more at the dark waves and picture Dobby standing there, barefoot and small, looking at the moon one last time before closing his eyes. You imagine him thinking not of himself, but of socks drying by the fire, of Harry's crooked smile, of Luna's kindness. Freedom, even in its final breath, must have felt like belonging. The sea keeps rolling, the stars keep blinking, and the night carries on, as it always does after someone brave is gone. You whisper his name into the wind, and it carries the sound away, not lost, but stored. Some names, it seems, the world refuses to forget. The next morning rises pale and hushed, as if the world itself has lowered its voice in respect. You walk the length of the beach slowly, feeling the sand cold beneath your feet. Every step presses a soft indentation into the earth, just like the ones Harry, Ron, and Luna must have left that dawn, carrying Dobby's small body in their arms. The air smells of salt and sorrow, the kind of scent that lingers on the edge of grief and gratitude. You reach the spot where they buried him. No magic, no wands, just hands and shovels and aching silence. It's strange how this modest mound of earth, barely marked except for a few stones and seashells, carries more sanctity than the grandest wizarding tombs. You kneel beside it, tracing the uneven letters carved into the stone. Here lies Dobby, a free elf. The words are crooked, imperfect, utterly sincere. You could spend a lifetime studying wizarding history and never find a phrase that captures more truth in fewer syllables. The act of burial itself became a kind of quiet rebellion. Wizards rarely bury elves, they fade or are disposed of without ceremony. But Harry's choice changed that custom forever. In the years since, a few elves who gained freedom requested the same. Earth burial, they called it, a return to the elements. Magical historians like to call that moment the dawn at Shell Cottage, the beginning of moral reform in magical creature law. A footnote in the Wizengamot transcripts even records that one particularly stubborn bureaucrat argued, "We cannot grant rights to beings who wear tea cozies." Yet here you are, kneeling on ground that refutes every prejudice in that sentence. The earth doesn't care for hierarchy. It equalizes everyone in the end. And maybe that's why Dobby's grave feels so at peace, because he'd already understood that long before anyone else. You brush the sand gently from the inscription and realize how time has treated it kindly. Moss has begun to grow between the carved letters, like nature's way of underlining them. In a way, it's fitting. He never needed grandeur. He only ever wanted kindness. And this resting place, simple and unadorned, feels like the universe finally giving it back to him. A few shells are arranged near the stone, offerings from visitors, some old enough to be bleached white by sun and years. A child once left a pair of doll-sized socks here, knitted in uneven stripes of red and green. You smile at that. No relic could ever mean more. There's something deeply moving about how love keeps showing up in mismatched shapes. You sit beside the grave, and for a moment, the sound of the sea softens, like it's listening. You wonder what the survivors must have felt that morning. The exhaustion, the numbness, the impossible weight of continuing. Hermione wept quietly. Ron tried to hide it. Luna spoke softly about stars guiding spirits. Harry said nothing, because some losses are too sacred for words. That silence became legend. The moment when the boy who was meant to save everyone realized what saving costs. Historians later wrote that Dobby's burial marked a moral turning point for Harry, the night he stopped being a symbol and started being human again. There's a gentle irony in all of it. Wizards have always built elaborate memorials for their dead, white marble angels, gilded epitaphs. But this humble grave, dug by hand, became the most visited site in wizarding Britain after the war. Pilgrims come quietly. No tours, no merchandise, no grand speeches, just people leaving little tokens of gratitude, socks, buttons, letters folded into seashells. The ministry tried to regulate it once, declaring unauthorized magical gatherings on coastal property, but the backlash was swift and fierce. Even bureaucrats know when they're outmatched by affection. You chuckle softly at the thought. Imagine trying to find someone for loving a hero too much. As the wind picks up, you wrap your arms around your knees and watch the waves creep closer to the grave, stopping just short as if bowing. The sea glimmers under the gray light, and the world feels suspended between mourning and peace. It strikes you that the greatest magic isn't in spells or wands, but in remembrance. Because remembrance keeps love from disappearing, keeps courage alive long after the body is gone. The tide will erase every footprint on this beach, but not this story. You whisper his name again, softly, reverently, and feel the air respond, carrying it toward the horizon where the light begins to change. The sea is calmer now, the kind of calm that feels earned. Morning light spills across the dunes like soft gold dust, touching the grave, the cottage, and even you. You breathe it in, the scent of salt, heather, and something older, something like memory. Time has moved on, of course, but stories like this don't dissolve. They sediment. They settle into the quiet layers beneath ordinary days, waiting for someone like you to uncover them again. Dobby's name still circulates in wizarding circles, though never as a myth, always as a reminder. His story has become a lesson taught in defense against the dark arts classes at Hogwarts, not for its magic, but for its ethics. There's even a small exhibit in the castle's newly built Hall of Memory. A single sock sits behind glass, frayed and faded, lit by a charm that never flickers out. Beneath it, the placard reads, "Freedom is never given. It's claimed." You imagine students pausing there, maybe whispering a thank you before hurrying to class. That's legacy, not carved in stone, but carried in hearts. The ministry eventually issued a proclamation, quietly, of course, acknowledging Dobby's service to the wizarding community. It didn't make front-page news. Bureaucracies don't know what to do with souls that small and powerful. But his influence crept in anyway. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures was restructured, and for the first time, house elves were permitted representation. Not many took it. Old traditions die slower than old spells, but the door was open. Some historians call this the Dobby Amendment. A few mock it, calling it sentimental lawmaking, but the younger wizards defend it fiercely. "We owe him more than gratitude," one auror once told a journalist. "We owe him perspective." That might be the truest thing ever said in that building. As you stroll along the cliff path, the wind plays in your hair, and you picture how his story rippled outward. Luna Lovegood published an essay about him years later titled "Invisible Heroes of the Second Wizarding War." She wrote that Dobby taught her that courage doesn't need grandeur, that even tiny hands can turn the tide. The essay became required reading in Muggle studies, an irony Dobby would have adored. Even Hermione, long after her ministry days, championed laws that banned house elf enslavement altogether. Some say she did it out of guilt. Others know it was love. The act passed on the anniversary of Dobby's death. When the final vote was cast, a strong breeze swept through the courtroom, rattling every parchment in the chamber. It startled everyone but Hermione, who simply smiled. "That's him," she said. "He's still tidying up." The scholars, of course, keep debating the same impossible question. How could a being engineered for servitude become the purest symbol of freedom? One theory claims that Dobby's transformation was catalyzed by exposure to human compassion, a sort of emotional alchemy. Another insists he was unique, a singular miracle in a flawed system. But one philosopher, a quiet woman who studied both Muggle and magical ethics, wrote something that feels closer to truth. Dobby was not a mutation of his kind. He was the prototype of what all kindness could become. You pause as you read those words from memory, feeling them land like a soft charm on your chest. As you reach the top of the hill overlooking the sea, you see something that wasn't there before, a small carving in the sand, barely visible from the path. Someone, maybe a child, has written, "Dobby is free again," the letters uneven and honest. You smile. It seems no matter how much time passes, the world keeps rewriting that line, as if afraid to forget. A pair of gulls fly past, squabbling loudly, and for a split second, their cries almost sound like laughter. His laughter, mischievous and unashamed. You laugh back because somehow that feels right. The waves below shimmer, bright as mirrors, and you catch your own reflection in them, small, imperfect, and temporary. But in that reflection, you see him too, not as a servant or a martyr, but as what he truly was, a being who dared to love in a world built on fear. Maybe that's why his story still hums beneath the surface of magic itself. Because even the grandest spells fade, but kindness lingers. Evening returns, that soft blue hour when the sky forgets whether it belongs to day or night. You find yourself back where you began, on the beach at Shell Cottage, and the world feels smaller now, like a secret folded into your hands. The tide has come in, smoothing the sand, erasing the footprints of everyone who has ever stood here. Only the faint rise of the grave remains, humble and undisturbed. You sink into the cool sand and let the rhythm of the waves fill the silence inside you. The sea moves the way memory does, never still, never cruel, just constant. You think of Dobby's final words, that small smile, that impossible bravery, and realize he didn't die trying to be free. He died already free. It's a truth so simple it hurts to understand. Freedom isn't what you gain when chains break. It's what you live when you stop waiting for permission to care. That was Dobby's magic all along. Years have passed since that night, and yet his echo lingers everywhere. The elves who still serve wizards sometimes whisper his name before lighting fires, a habit scholars call ritualized gratitude. Hogwarts students leave socks on the castle's highest windowsills every spring equinox, a custom without a founder, but with an unmistakable sincerity. Even Muggle-born children who've never seen a house elf speak of him as a bedtime legend, the one who saved a hero with nothing but a kitchen knife wound and a stubborn heart. It's funny how history often mistakes grandeur for greatness. Dobby's story proves otherwise. No crown, no wand, no prophecy, just a threadbare heart and an unshakable belief that good is worth doing, even when no one notices. Maybe that's why his story still refuses to fade, because it reminds the rest of us that heroism doesn't need scale, it just needs intent. You glance up. The moon has risen, silver, distant, but kind enough to share its light. The sea below glitters like scattered glass, and the wind carries faint whispers from the grass behind you. For a moment, the world feels sacred, suspended between grief and grace. You close your eyes and imagine Dobby somewhere beyond sight, a little taller now maybe, wearing his favorite socks and laughing at the thought that wizards still can't fold laundry properly. The thought makes you smile through the ache. You whisper a thank you, not to the story, but to the soul behind it, because he proved something profound, that goodness, when chosen freely, bends the world just a little closer to right. The night deepens around you. The surf softens and everything slows. The sand cools beneath your palms. The stars hum faintly above, endless and indifferent, yet somehow benevolent. You realize that every tale, no matter how full of wonder, ends the same way. Not in silence, but in continuation. Someone else will walk this beach tomorrow, trace those same letters, whisper the same name. The sea will listen. The wind will carry it on. That's what legacies do. They ripple, gentle and unstoppable. You stay until the last line of light slips beneath the horizon, until the darkness feels less like loss and more like rest. Then you rise, brush the sand from your hands, and turn away, knowing the story will stay here, breathing without you. You walk slowly up the dunes, your steps soft, your mind quieter than it has been in hours. The night has fully taken the sky now, draped in navy and threaded with stars that blink like gentle reminders. The sea behind you keeps its steady rhythm, a heartbeat older than grief. You feel it pulsing through the ground, up through your souls, into your chest, an echo of everything Dobby lived for. It's strange how peace can sneak up on you like that, not in grand revelations, but in soft acceptance. The air is cooler, scented faintly of lavender and salt, and each breath feels like a little unspoken thank you. In the distance, a lantern flickers from the cottage window, a single warm point in the vast blue dark. You imagine its light stretching out across the waves, across years, across every person who's ever found comfort in stories like this. You let it fill you until you feel light yourself, weightless, like the tide could lift you if it wanted. You think of all the hands that dug that grave, all the hearts that broke that night, and how somehow, through love, they built something that never needed repairing. The thought calms you, anchors you. As you reach the top of the dune, you pause for one last look. The beach below glimmers softly beneath the moon, timeless, eternal. You smile, not sadly this time, but gently, knowingly. The story's done, but its warmth lingers, like the hush after a lullaby. So you breathe in, exhale slowly, and whisper what you've learned tonight. Freedom begins wherever kindness refuses to end. Then you let the quiet have the final word.